Here on the line today, I have Anika Molesworth, who's the author of the newly published book, Our Sunburnt Country. And also I have Australian Rural Regional News' own Kookaburra, who has read and reviewed Anika's book. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Now, Anika, how has the book been received so far? How long has it been out, and what responses have you had?
Well, tomorrow it will have been out a whole month, which I can hardly believe because that month has flown by very quickly, and it has been received really well. I am absolutely delighted by the feedback I've been receiving, people saying that it's really opened their eyes to the challenges that climate change is presenting farmers and people in rural communities, but also not leaving them in a pit of despair, but bringing them to the solutions and actually giving them hope for the future. So I'm really happy about it.
That's great. Hope has been in a little bit short supply on a number of things lately, so that's very heartening. Kookaburra, I know you must have a whole pile of questions that you'd like to ask Anika since you've read the book. So what would you like to ask?
So was this the sort of the purpose behind the book, Anika, to be able to provide a bit of a pathway forward for farmers and the more general population to find ways of working together, particularly around one of your major themes, which is the need for better nutrition?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I wrote the book for one reason, that I love writing. Like, I absolutely love the craft of stringing words together, painting pictures in people's minds. And I think there is a great need for storytelling around climate science. You know, so often climate change has been presented in quite an abstract and academic way, which isn't terribly engaging, which doesn't really motivate people to act. And so this was kind of a book that I wanted to read, that I wanted to find on a bookshelf somewhere. So I set about writing it and interviewing people right around the world. And as I listened to their stories, I heard them tell me about their concerns about changing, rainfall patterns, higher temperatures, how it was impacting what they could grow and where they could grow. But they also told me about how, they get up every day and tackle these challenges head on. And in their minds, they have a vision for the world that they are striving to create. And they know that we can only create that by working together, by sharing our ideas and stories, and by having the courage to front up to the really big challenges we face. And so I hope the reader of this book sort of sees the science and understands its magnitude and urgency for action, but also to realize there are so many amazing people out there already trying to tackle this problem, and that they too, as the reader, can help be a part of the solutions.
No, that's absolutely right. A lot of the book is devoted to really your discussions with individual farmers in many different countries around the world, and you have your own personal connection to the land. Perhaps you could just expand a bit on that.
Absolutely. So I live in far western New South Wales on the beautiful red sand lands of Our Country. And my family purchased this property when I was 12 years old. And I remember coming out here on those first few trips and just being amazed at this landscape. The horizons just went on forever. The skies were just so big. I would see emus marching across the fields, and I would stumble across, their nests of these giant green watermelon-sized eggs. And I was just, captivated by my surrounds. But the year 2000 was also the start of the decade-long millennium drought, where much of Australia received little to no rainfall for nearly 10 years. And the far west of New South Wales was particularly hard hit. And so for the following years after purchasing the property, I watched it deteriorate before my eyes. The dams evaporated and mud cracks appeared. The vegetation and the seed in the ground just blew away in the dust storms. And it really saddened me to see the land being impacted in that way. And I guess that's when I really realized that I had formed quite a bond to this place. And I was concerned about the health of this landscape. And I wanted to know more about how I could play a role in looking after it. And that's really propelled, everything I went on to do and continue to do today in regards to, climate change advocacy and environmental conservation.
Perhaps, no, that's great. I bought a farm in 2005, so sort of understand the difficulties of those days and the way in which the land just dried out completely. But the marvellous thing about it is it does ultimately come back again. And you describe various conditions and comes back again provided we look after it, I should hasten to say. And you describe various conditions around the world. Perhaps you could just describe to the listeners some of the different farmers you met and the different challenges which they face.
Sure. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky to do a fair bit of traveling around the world and working with farmers in a whole lot of different regions. I've spent part of my master's and my PhD in Southeast Asia, primarily Laos and Cambodia, working with subsistence, small-scale farmers there and the agricultural researchers. And when I got back to Australia, a lot of people sort of raised their eyebrows and thought, what does an arid zone sheep and goat farmer have to do with a rice grower in Cambodia? What similarities do you share? And although our practices are quite different and what we're growing is quite different, the challenges that we face from something like climate change are actually quite similar. The reduction in rainfall, the changes in seasonal conditions, the higher temperatures, the pests and diseases that are appearing that we had never seen before. And I think this is why the conversation between farmers and agricultural researchers around the globe is really, opening up and it has quite a vigorous discussion, is because we're all in this together. We're trying to feed a global population and we're all being challenged by climate change. And then we also realize that the agricultural sector plays such an important role in the solutions. And that's when we start to look at, how do we improve soil fertility? How do we maintain vegetation cover, look after our water resources, ensure that we have vibrant biodiversity long into the future? And so those are similar conversations held by people in the farming community right around the world.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned feeding the global population. And one other theme I noticed in the book was the need for us to improve our nutrition, essentially, to improve our use of food and and by doing that, we can learn to live more in line with nature and in line with the planet. Can you expand upon that a bit?
Yeah, so I guess, we walk into the supermarket shops these days and we see candy bars and chocolates and packets of chips, and we see a lot of unhealthy food on the shelves, which is, wrapped in an abundance of, styrofoam and plastic that have been, brought in from the other side of the world and have very low nutrient value. So they're not good for us to eat, and they're not good for the planet to be actually producing these things. So something that I touch on in my book is how do we feed a rapidly growing global population, but how do we feed them well, with the right nutrition so we have healthy bodies and we can maintain that, that well-being that is needed for both people and the planet.
Sometimes there's the issue of farmers versus environmentalists comes up. I mean, it's not it's quite often a regular point of conflict, I suppose. But I gather from your perspective and from reading the book that you actually see the farming and the environmental communities being able to work together. And something we are striving to find within Australian Rural and Regional News is where we can turn these apparent conflicts into resolutions and win-win situations where we can all move forward together. How do you see that?
Yeah, and I think a few years ago, 5, 10 years ago, there was definitely more of a divide between environmental groups and farming groups. And I think we've actually come a lot closer, and we are collaborating a lot better and realizing that we share similar values, that we share similar goals of having healthy, productive environments that actually support communities and support the natural biodiversity and natural, wildlife out there. And I think we have come a lot closer, driven by some very challenging conditions that we have faced here in Australia over the last few years, such as massive bushfires, such as the drought, such as the floods. And there has been a growing awareness throughout Australian society that our environment, is calling out that it needs help, that it is suffering, that we are not managing it in a way that is actually responsible or sustainable. And as farmers are the custodians of such large expanses of land in Australia, we need to be asking the farmers and building the capacity within the farming community to do just that, to actually look after the land in the best way possible. And this is a learning experience for all of us. We're all being confronted by the climate challenge, and so we all need to work together on how to get ourselves out of this mess.
So what would be the ultimate aim? Well, I suppose there'd be the short-term aim of writing the book and then the longer-term objectives.
Well, I guess the short-term aim would be, I would love people to feel a connection with the land, with the environment, as I do, as I describe in the book. I feel like I could almost reach down and put my hand on the earth out here on the home soils and sort of feel my own heart beating. Like, that's how connected I feel to this place. I really do feel a sense of belonging, and that really engenders my, desire to look after it, that care and compassion to take care of this fragile, vulnerable landscape. And so I really do hope people who read the book, take the time to reflect on those places that are special to them, those places that they call home, and to think about, well, how are they changing, and how can I as an individual look after them? I guess the longer term objectives, we need to try and return the climate to a natural, stable state. At the moment, it's becoming a runaway climate disaster, in that, the changes are happening at such a rate and magnitude, farmers like myself are struggling to actually keep pace with them. And that has real ramifications for everyone, because what happens in the farming sector influences the food on your plate. And so every meal on every plate is being threatened by a changing climate. And then we should also recognize that there are so many opportunities out there. And this is where the conversation starts to get really exciting. When we think about, what we can do as individuals, as communities, as nations to tackle this problem, and the flow of benefits that we receive from them. We do get cleaner air when we stop pumping dangerous greenhouse gases and particulates into the atmosphere. We do have, flowing rivers like they should be when we adopt better irrigation practices in our fields. We have more stable rural communities and more vibrant rural economies when we look at, the innovative technologies and industries of the future that are required, such as renewable energies. In Australia, we are the sunniest and windiest continent on Earth, and farmers who have expansive parcels of land could host solar panels and wind turbines that will give them financial security to ride out the rough times like the droughts. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing, and we need to work out how do we accelerate and scale them up. We need, careful consideration and actually be proactive on these issues, and work out what strategies are required and what steps we need to be taken, because we obviously we have to transition to a low carbon economy. How are we going to do that? And the longer we delay having these conversations, or having, a misleading narrative, in mainstream press about all the challenges and the damages and how this is going to ruin rural economies and, force people out of rural townships, it doesn't actually help. So I think we have to be, absolutely science and evidence-based and look at this, what can we do in the best possible way that's going to benefit people, the landscape, the health of our planet, the biodiversity, and we need a collaborative effort, and we need diverse thinkers and doers part of that. So in many parts of the country, like where I am, it's getting hotter and drier, and so the conversations that I have around the dinner table with my family is, well, how do we best prepare for those hotter and drier conditions? How do we adapt to a changing climate? And that is looking at suitable livestock breeds that, are better suited to hotter and drier conditions. It might be questioning whether to, move away from livestock altogether in the very fragile, arid regions and look at something completely different. It's trying to connect researchers, scientists, with the people who are actually growing the food, so they actually have the best knowledge of what's actually happening, what are the projections saying, what solutions and innovations are out there that can be adopted. And so, all of that is important, the research, the development, the extension, and then obviously the on-ground implementation of those practices and technologies too.
What are your next steps then? Are you going to write another book, or how do you see yourself moving forward with this overall plan?
Well, I'm very much involved in the communication space at the moment, and it's something that I'm very passionate about because farmers make up less than 1% of the population here in Australia, and we're being very challenged by some really big global issues, and we want to be part of the solutions. But we can't do that just by leaning over the fence and having a chat with our neighbour. We need all people, engaged. This is food, so it does concern everyone. So I'm going to be playing a role in the foreseeable future of trying to communicate those issues, trying to bridge that divide between rural and urban audiences and encourage people to be part of the creative thinking, the problem solving that this issue requires.
Thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing your knowledge, and I wish you all the best with Our Sunburnt Country.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you for having me on this podcast. It's a terrific platform to engage people and share, concerns as well as the solutions. So thank you for having me on.